The Oval Office was a fortress of dim light and swirling smoke as John F. Kennedy hunched over his desk, the faint glow of a desk lamp illuminating a stack of intelligence briefs. It was January 1963, and the chill seeping through the windows matched the unease in his gut. The Bay of Pigs fiasco of 1961 lingered like a bad taste. CIA operatives had bungled the invasion, leaving him to face the world's scorn. Now, 2 years later, he saw the agency not as a tool but as a beast, its leash slipping from his grasp. He crushed a cigarette into an ashtray, the ember hissing out, and muttered, "They're not my dogs anymore." The door swung open, and Arthur Schlesinger Jr. stepped in, his frame dwarfed by a thick dossier clutched in his hands. "Jack, this can't wait," he said, his voice clipped with urgency. He dropped the 15-page memo onto the desk, its title stark against the white paper. The rogue state within. The CIA's running wild, guns to anti-Castro Cubans, heroin out of Laos and Vietnam, all off the books. They're a shadow government, funding their wars with dirty money. JFK's fingers traced the pages, his brow furrowing as he read. Each line was a brick in a wall of betrayal he hadn't seen coming. He leaned back, the chair groaning under him, and fixed Schlesinger with a steely gaze. "That's not the half of it, Arthur," he said, his Boston accent sharpening. "I'm done with the Federal Reserve bleeding us dry. Private bankers printing our dollars, charging us interest. It's a racket. I want the Treasury to take over, issue our own currency, silver-backed, no strings." Schlesinger's jaw tightened, his glasses glinting in the lamplight. "Jack, that's a Molotov cocktail. Wall Street, the Fed, they'll come for you." JFK's lips curled into a defiant smirk. "Good. Let's see who blinks first." Outside, the wind battered the White House, a harbinger of the storm he was stirring. Weeks bled into sleepless nights, and JFK burrowed deeper into the muck. His desk became a war zone, classified cables, scrawled notes, coffee stains marking his obsession. Schlesinger's memo wasn't just theory. He found proof in the files. CIA operatives funneling rifles to Miami exiles, shadowy deals with mob couriers moving heroin from the Golden Triangle. The profits fueled black ops, wars he'd never signed off on. He summoned CIA Director John McCone to the White House, his voice a low growl as he paced the room. "Explain this, John," he snapped, slamming a dossier onto the resolute desk. "Your boys are playing Pablo Escobar and James Bond, while I'm left holding the bag." McCone, lean and silver-haired, spread his hands in a practiced gesture. "Mr. President, these are field rumors, overblown, unverified. We're fighting Reds, not running cartels." His tone was silk, but JFK smelled the lie. "Don't bullshit me," he shot back, eyes blazing. "I want names, ledgers, or I'll gut your agency myself." McCone left with a tight nod, but the confrontation lit a fuse. In Langley, James Angleton, the CIA's counterintelligence czar, lit a cigarette in his cluttered office, the smoke curling around a photo of Kennedy. "He's a liability," he rasped to Richard Helms, his deputy. "A bleeding heart in a Cold War." Helms' eyes narrowed. "He's digging his grave." Across the sea, another front opened. In Tel Aviv, David Ben-Gurion stared at a letter from JFK, dated May 18, 1963, its words a cold ultimatum. Open Dimona to U.S. inspections or risk losing American support. Israel's nuclear dream was at stake, and Kennedy's insistence, coupled with his push for Palestinian refugees, felt like a chokehold. "He's cornering us," Ben-Gurion growled to Isser Harel, Mossad's iron-willed chief. Harel's scarred fingers drummed the table. "Angleton's our man. He hates Kennedy as much as we do." A coded message winged its way to Langley, landing in Angleton's hands. A whisper of alliance, a shared enemy. In Washington, Lyndon Johnson brooded in his private study, a tumbler of bourbon sweating in his grip. The vice presidency was a gilded prison, Kennedy's shadow suffocating his ambitions. That night, Texas oil barons crowded his room, their Stetsons casting long shadows. "Jack's tax hikes'll kill us," one spat. "And this Treasury scheme, busting the Fed? He's a damn fool." LBJ swirled his drink, his drawl slow and deliberate. "Fools don't last long, boys. Keep your wallets ready." The air thickened with unspoken promises, ambition threading through every word. By mid-1963, the conspiracy took root. Angleton, cloaked in cigarette haze, gathered his patriots in a Langley basement. Hardliners who saw JFK as a traitor to their clandestine creed. He tapped Lee Harvey Oswald, an ex-Marine with a tangled past, as their fall guy. Oswald's defection to the Soviets and return made him a perfect communist bogeyman. He's our ghost, Angleton said, passing a file to an operative. Build his story, loud, messy, believable. JFK, blind to the gathering shadows, doubled down. On June 4th, he signed Executive Order 11110, greenlighting Treasury-issued silver certificates, a quiet rebellion against the Federal Reserve. Bankers in New York blanched, whispers of treason rippling through marble halls. Schlesinger caught him in the Rose Garden, his voice tight. "Jack, you're painting a target. The CIA, the banks, they won't sit still." JFK clapped his shoulder, grinning. "Let him squirm. This is bigger than them." That night, in a Georgetown bar thick with smoke, Angleton met a Mossad liaison, a man with a scarred cheek and a folder of secrets. "Damona's our line in the sand," the Israeli said, sliding maps and schedules across the table. "Kennedy's pushing us over it." Angleton's gaunt face stayed stone, but his eyes flicked with agreement. "He's pushing us all. We'll fix it together." They clinked glasses, a pact forged in the dim light, the clatter of ice sealing their intent. Outside, the Potomac shimmered under a sliver of moon, unaware of the blood it would soon reflect. The seeds were sown and betrayal was blooming. Summer 1963 hung heavy over Washington, the air thick with humidity and unspoken threats. In the White House, John F. Kennedy sat at his desk, a fortress of papers and half-drunk coffee cups. His war on the CIA had become a crusade. Every memo he sent demanded audits. Every meeting pressed for answers about covert ops he hadn't authorized. "They're a hydra," he told Arthur Schlesinger Jr., his voice sharp with frustration. "Cut one head and two grow back. I want it all, names, dates, where the money's going." Schlesinger adjusted his glasses, his face pale. "Jack, you're kicking a nest. They'll sting." In New Orleans, under a blistering sun, Lee Harvey Oswald stood in a dusty alley, handing out pro-Castro leaflets to indifferent passers-by. His shirt clung to his back, sweat streaking his face as he shouted about revolution. Hours later, in a dimly lit bar, a man in a gray suit slid him an envelope of cash. "Good work, Lee," the CIA handler said, his voice flat. "Keep the noise up." Oswald nodded, pocketing the money, blind to the strings pulling him. He thought he was a patriot, rooting out commies. He didn't know James Angleton had cast him as the perfect scapegoat. At Langley, Angleton's office was a haze of cigarette smoke and paranoia. He'd found his executioner in William Greer, a Secret Service driver with a slow drawl and a grudge against Kennedy's high-minded reforms. "You're our man," Angleton said, handing Greer a dossier in a basement meet. "History's calling." Greer's eyes glinted, a smirk tugging at his lips. In Washington, Lyndon Johnson hosted Texas oil barons in his study, bourbon flowing like water. "Jack's tax hikes'll gut us," one growled. "And this Treasury nonsense, printing his own money? He's a dead man walking." LBJ leaned back, his grin predatory. "Patience, fellas. Dead men don't talk." The conspiracy wove its threads tighter. In Tel Aviv, Isser Harel stared at a map of Dimona, JFK's latest demand for inspections a thorn in his side. "He's choking our future," he rasped to a deputy, his voice gravelly with resolve. Mossad tracked Kennedy's moves, his Palestinian sympathies, his nuclear hardline, and saw a threat to Israel's survival. Harel dialed a secure line to Angleton. "We need him out," he said. "You get Dimona off our back, we'll supply the tools, passports, guns, clean exits." Angleton exhaled smoke into the phone. Done. A crate of untraceable gear soon shipped from Haifa, bound for Dallas. Angleton met Carlos Marcello in a Louisiana bayou shack, the mob boss's jowls quivering as he lit a cigar. The CIA's heroin pipeline, Golden Triangle to Marcello's casinos, had been a cash cow until JFK's audits loomed. "He's too close," Marcello growled. "Dallas is mine, set it there." Angleton nodded. "Oswald's the decoy, we'll handle the rest." Marcello's men would lock down the city, a favor for their cut of the dope trade. Angleton added a second shooter, a CIA marksman, lean and silent, assigned to the grassy knoll. "First shot wounds him," Angleton briefed the man. "Chaos clears the way." The marksman chambered around, his face a blank slate. JFK, oblivious, met Treasury Secretary Douglas Dillon in the Oval Office, a silver dollar spinning on his desk. "It's set, Doug," he said, tapping a draft speech. "Next year, we launch Treasury notes. No Fed, no bankers skimming the top." Dillon's brow furrowed. "Jack, you're begging for a fight. Wall Street will crash before they bend." JFK's grin was fierce. "Then they crash. This is ours." The plan was locked for 1964, a seismic shift that rattled the financial elite. Greer trained at a Virginia range, his silenced pistol barking in short, deadly bursts. Close range, one chance, his CIA handler coached, watching Greer nail the target. "You're the finisher." Greer's hands didn't shake. In Dallas, Oswald met another handler, a shadow in a diner booth. "You're infiltrating Reds, Lee, hero work," the man lied. Oswald bought it, his fate sealed. Angleton's patriots gathered in Langley, maps of Dallas spread out. "He's treason," Helms said, tracing Dealey Plaza. "Grassy Knoll starts it, Greer ends it." The CIA saw JFK's audits and currency scheme as a betrayal of their world order. October 1963 settled over Texas like a held breath. LBJ drove to Austin, meeting Governor John Connally under a gnarled oak. "November's going to shake things up," he drawled, his voice a low rumble. Connally raised an eyebrow but stayed quiet. He knew LBJ's games. Dallas was the stage, its streets seethed with anti-Kennedy bile, its angles perfect for a kill, and it was LBJ's turf. The oilmen had pledged cash and loyalty, their hatred of JFK's taxes and Fed-busting sealed with a nod. JFK planned his Texas trip, a bid to charm a hostile state. He laughed with aides in the West Wing, tweaking a speech. "They'll see reason," he said, blind to the noose tightening. His audits had rattled Langley, his Treasury plan lit fuses in New York, but he pressed on, fueled by conviction. Schlesinger watched, his gut churning. "Careful, Jack," he murmured, but Kennedy waved it off, his optimism a shield. In Langley, Angleton stood alone, a black and white photo of JFK pinned to his wall. He traced the president's face with a bony finger, his voice a whisper. "Your clock's ticking." The Patriots had their lineup. The Grassy Knoll shooter to wound, Greer to kill, Oswald to take the fall, Mossad with the gear, Marcello with the ground. LBJ waited in the wings, his ambition the final knot. Outside, the moon hung low, casting shadows over a nation sliding toward a reckoning. The web was taut, and Kennedy was its prey. November 22, 1963, broke over Dallas with a crisp, mocking clarity, the sky a pristine blue as John F. Kennedy's motorcade hummed through streets alive with cheers. Inside the open Lincoln Continental, JFK leaned back, his grin flashing as he waved to the crowd, Jackie radiant in pink beside him. "Not a bad welcome," he said, his voice light, brushing off the morning's Dallas news venom calling him a traitor. William Greer gripped the wheel, his face a stone mask, his right hand inches from a concealed compartment hiding a silenced pistol. Loaded, primed, cold. His pulse was steady, his orders etched in his mind. 6 floors up in the Texas School Book Depository, Lee Harvey Oswald crouched by a window, sweat beading on his forehead as he peered through a Mannlicher Carcano rifle's scope. The CIA-supplied weapon trembled slightly in his grip. "Make it loud," his handler had said, and Oswald thought he was staging a bust, a hero's play. He didn't know the rounds were blanks, his role a distraction in a deadly script. The motorcade turned onto Houston Street, and he exhaled, finger on the trigger, waiting for the moment. On the grassy knoll, a CIA marksman, lean, silent, a ghost in a gray coat, knelt behind a picket fence, his rifle steady against his shoulder. Angleton's orders were clear. First shot, neck, non-lethal. Start the chaos. His scope tracked the Lincoln, his breath a whisper in the morning air. Across Dealey Plaza, a Mossad operative perched in a drab office, radio crackling in his ear, false passports and a burner phone at hand. "All set," he murmured into the headset, his scarred fingers poised. In Langley, James Angleton lit a cigarette, the secure line humming. At Love Field, Lyndon Johnson lingered with aides, his bulk a coiled spring, waiting for the world to shift. The trap was sprung, and Dallas was the killing floor. The motorcade eased onto Elm Street, tires humming. The clock ticking toward 12:30 p.m. Greer's eyes flicked to the rearview mirror, catching JFK's profile. Smiling, alive, a target. "Close now," he muttered under his breath, the handler's words looping. "You finish it." The crowd roared, a wave of sound cloaking the tension. In the depository, Oswald sighted the car and fired, 3 sharp cracks splitting the air. The shots echoed, wild and wide, punching into asphalt and a curb, one grazing a bystander's cheek. Screams erupted, heads turned upward, perfect misdirection. The grassy knoll marksman adjusted his aim, JFK's neck framed in his crosshairs. He squeezed the trigger, a single sharp crack, and the bullet tore through Kennedy's throat. JFK's hands flew up, clutching his neck, his face contorting in pain as blood seeped between his fingers. Jackie gasped, reaching for him, her voice lost in the growing panic. The wound was deliberate, crippling, not fatal, designed to stun, to scatter focus. The crowd surged, some diving for cover, others pointing at the knoll, but the marksman was already melting into shadow, his rifle stashed in a ditch. Greer slowed the Lincoln. Too slow, a breach of protocol, his foot easing off as the car crawled through Dealey Plaza. He turned, his motion swift, mechanical, locking eyes with JFK for a fleeting second. "Endgame," he whispered, yanking the pistol free. A muffled pop cut the air, the silenced round slamming into Kennedy's head point blank. Blood and bones sprayed across Jackie's suit, her scream a raw, animal sound as she clawed at the seat. JFK slumped, his skull shattered, eyes blank, the kill shot delivered with surgical calm. The car jolted forward, Greer gunning it toward Parkland Hospital, tires squealing as agents scrambled, some frozen, others in on the play. Oswald dropped the rifle, his breath ragged. "Move," he thought, racing down the stairs, handler's words echoing. Theater 2 blocks. He didn't know he was the fall guy, his prints on a useless gun sealing his fate. The Mossad operative scribbled target eliminated, dismantling his radio with practiced speed. Damona's shadow lifted. Angleton crushed his cigarette in Langley, the line crackling. Done. The Patriots had executed it. Grassy Knoll to wound, Greer to kill, Oswald to burn. At Love Field, an aide rushed to LBJ whispering, "It's over." Johnson's face stayed stone, but his mind raced. Power was his, the oilman's pact fulfilled, Kennedy's dreams dead. The Lincoln screeched into Parkland's bay, doctors swarming as Jackie sobbed, clutching JFK's limp hand. Greer slipped out, blending into the chaos, his role vanishing like smoke. Nurses shouted, gurneys clattered, but the president was gone, blood pooling on the leather seat, a nation's hope extinguished in seconds. At 1 p.m., Dr. Malcolm Perry stepped back in Parkland's trauma room, his voice breaking as he pronounced Kennedy dead. "Time of death, 1 o'clock, he said, the words heavy over the gore-streaked table. Jackie stood frozen, her gloves crimson, staring at the body as orderlies wheeled it away. Greer lingered in a hallway unnoticed, then drifted outside, lost in the swarm of cops and agents. His pension was secure, his silence bought, Angleton's promise kept. In Dallas, Oswald slipped into the Texas Theater, sinking into a seat, his chest heaving. Sirens wailed closer. A planted tip had cops on his tail, branding him the lone killer. Aboard Air Force One, Lyndon Johnson stood in the tight cabin, right hand raised, swearing the oath as a judge recited the words. Jackie watched, numb, her husband's blood drying on her skirt. LBJ's voice was firm, his eyes glinting with a victor's edge. Vice to president in a heartbeat, just as planned. The plane taxied, lifting off with a new regime aboard. In a Dallas safe house, the Mossad operative torched his papers, ashes curling into a bucket. "Damona's safe," he muttered, slipping out the back, a phantom in the dusk. Angleton stood in Langley, a map of Dallas pinned to his wall, red lines tracing Elm Street, a cross at the kill zone. He lit another cigarette, the glow catching his hollowed face. The Patriots had won, Grassy Knoll to wound, Greer to end it, Oswald to bury it. Hours after the shots rang out in Dallas, Lyndon Johnson stood aboard Air Force One, his broad hand pressed against a Bible as he swore the oath of office on November 22, 1963. Jackie Kennedy watched, her pink suit stained with her husband's blood, her eyes hollow as a judge droned the words. The plane's engines hummed, a low growl beneath LBJ's steady voice, his Texas drawl masking the triumph flickering in his chest. Power was his, wrested from chaos, and he wasted no time. Landing in Washington, he dialed J. Edgar Hoover at the FBI, his tone curt. "Edgar, clean this mess up, fast. I want a story that sticks." Hoover's gravelly assent crackled through the line. At Langley, James Angleton moved like a specter through his smoke-filled office, shredding files with mechanical precision. Greer's dossier, Mossad's coded cables, the Grassy Knoll shooter's profile. Into the incinerator they went, ashes curling into a steel bin. The CIA's Patriots had won, but victory demanded silence. In Dallas, agents swarmed Dealey Plaza, scooping up stray bullet fragments from the curb. Evidence of the Knoll shot that couldn't surface. A witness, a man in a plaid shirt, stammered to a cop about a puff of smoke from the fence. An unmarked car pulled up, and he vanished into custody, his story buried with a quiet threat. "Keep your mouth shut or lose it." Arthur Schlesinger Jr. paced his D.C. apartment, the TV blaring news of JFK's death. His memo, "The Rogue State Within," sat on his desk, its warnings now a grim prophecy. He suspected a setup, The grassy knoll whispers Greer's odd turn, but LBJ's aides had already iced him out. "Stay quiet, Arthur," one warned over the phone. "This is bigger than you." The Federal Reserve exhaled in New York, JFK's Treasury plan dead with him, their grip on the dollar intact. The Warren Commission formed days later, a puppet show under LBJ's thumb. Allen Dulles, the ex-CIA chief JFK had fired after the Bay of Pigs, took the helm, a fox guarding the henhouse. Angleton fed him the script. Oswald lone nut, end of story. The autopsy at Bethesda Naval Hospital was a farce. Doctors prodded JFK's corpse under CIA eyes, the neck wound's entry angle fudged, the headshot's exit path twisted to match a sixth-floor shot. Grassy knoll witnesses, 3 near the fence, 1 on the overpass, were dismissed as drunks or cranks, their statements shredded. Greer's turn, caught on Zapruder's film, was waved off as reflex, his pistol never mentioned. Jack Ruby entered the frame on November 24th, a squat figure in a fedora lurking in Dallas PD's basement. A nightclub owner with ties to Carlos Marcello's mob, he'd been tapped by a CIA intermediary, Angleton's man, on LBJ's tacit nod. "Oswald knows too much," the intermediary hissed in a backroom meet. "End it." Ruby's rap sheet made him expendable, his loyalty to Marcello's dope trade a leash. As Oswald shuffled through the basement, handcuffed and pale, cameras rolled live. Ruby lunged, a .38 revolver barking once. The slug tore through Oswald's gut, and he crumpled, blood pooling on concrete as cops tackled Ruby. "I did it for Jackie," he shouted, his voice cracking, a lie rehearsed, a hit masked as grief. Oswald died at Parkland, his secrets, CIA handlers, the blanks in his rifle, buried with him. In Langley, Oswald's handler, an operative named Davis, vanished that night. His body washed up in the Potomac a week later, a suicide with no note, his files torched. Marcello's mob ties faded into rumor, narcotics logs, Dallas safe houses, all scrubbed. Mossad's operative slipped out of Texas, his burner phone smashed, his false passport ash in a motel sink. LBJ leaned on Israel days later, a quiet call to Ben-Gurion. "Dimona's yours, no more questions." The nuclear card was played, the alliance sealed in blood. By 1964, the cover-up hardened into gospel. The Warren Commission's report landed on LBJ's desk, 888 pages of polished fiction. Oswald acted alone, 3 shots, no conspiracy. Schlesinger leaked his memo to a friend at The Nation, but it sank under the tide of official truth, dismissed as sour grapes. Greer retired to a quiet Virginia suburb, his pension fat, his lips sealed, Angleton's final handshake. The grassy knoll faded into myth, its shooter a ghost no one could name, the CIA's fingerprints wiped clean. In Tel Aviv, Isser Harel lit a cigarette, watching newsreels of LBJ's inauguration. Mossad's gamble had paid off, Dimona hummed unchecked, Kennedy's meddling a memory. Wall Street toasted the Fed's survival, JFK's silver certificates shelved, their power unthreatened. The CIA swelled under LBJ, its narcotics ops blooming in Vietnam, the Patriots' vision intact. Angleton hosted LBJ at a private Georgetown dinner, the clink of glasses cutting the silence. "To a stable future," Angleton said, his gaunt face lit by candlelight. LBJ raised his bourbon, his grin wide. "To order restored." Years rolled over the grave of John F. Kennedy like a slow tide, washing away his vision under Lyndon Johnson's heavy hand. By 1964, LBJ's presidency had cemented the conspiracy's gains. His drawl filled the airwaves with promises of stability, while the CIA swelled, its tentacles curling deeper into Vietnam. The heroin pipeline from the Golden Triangle, once threatened by JFK's audits, bloomed under new cover, Carlos Marcello's mob raking in cash as the agency funded proxy wars. In Tel Aviv, Dimona's reactors hummed unchecked, Israel's nuclear arsenal growing in the shadow of Kennedy's silenced demands. The Federal Reserve stood tall in New York, its dollar machine unchallenged, JFK's silver certificates a forgotten dream gathering dust in Treasury vaults. Arthur Schlesinger Jr. haunted his D.C. apartment, a ghost among books and regrets. His memo, The Rogue State Within, circulated in fringe circles, its warnings of a rogue CIA dismissed as the ravings of a grieving loyalist. He watched the Zapruder film on a borrowed projector, frame by frame, Greer's turn, the grassy knoll's faint haze, his gut screaming conspiracy, but his voice drowned by the Warren Commission's tome. "They got away with it," he muttered to an empty room, the TV flickering with LBJ's State of the Union. In Dallas, a retired Secret Service agent, once stationed near Greer that day, drank himself numb in a rundown bar. He didn't flinch. The man slurred to a barfly, recalling Greer's calm as the shots rang out. By morning, he was dead, liver failure, the coroner said, but guilt had pulled the trigger. The 1970s cracked the facade, but not enough. The House Select Committee on Assassinations, convened in 1976, poked at the official story, hinting at probable conspiracy, in its 1979 report. Acoustic evidence suggested a fourth shot, grassy knoll perhaps, but the trail went cold, witnesses long vanished or discredited. Lee Harvey Oswald's CIA ties seeped out through defectors and dog-eared files. A New Orleans handler, a Soviet defection too neat. But James Angleton, still a Langley specter, stonewalled every probe. National security, he rasped to a congressional aide, his cigarette smoke a shield. The committee named no names, and the lone gunman myth held, a battered but unbroken wall. LBJ died in 1973, his heart giving out on his Texas ranch, his secrets locked in a chest no one dared open. The oilmen who'd backed him toasted his memory, their fortunes safe from Kennedy's tax axe. Wall Street hummed, the Fed's grip ironclad, JFK's currency rebellion a footnote in dusty journals. Mossad's role stayed buried. Isser Harel retired to a quiet Tel Aviv flat, his scars a map of victories untold. The grassy knoll shooter, a nameless CIA wraith, faded into oblivion, his rifle rusting in some unmarked grave. Ruby rotted in a Dallas jail, convicted of Oswald's murder, his mob ties whispered but never proven. He died in 1967, cancer eating him fast, his last words a mumble about orders no one chased. The Zapruder film flickered in basements and backrooms, amateur sleuths parsing every frame. Greer's turn, the neck shots jolt, but the mainstream sneered. Schlesinger tried one last leak, slipping his memo to a Ramparts editor, but it sank under the weight of apathy. The truth was a ghost, haunting the edges of a nation too tired to look back. By 1991, the echoes had faded to a murmur, but one voice cut through the haze. On a crackling broadcast of the hour of the time, William Cooper, a former naval intelligence officer turned whistleblower, leaned into his microphone, his gravelly tone piercing the static. It was a warm Arizona night, and his words carried the weight of decades. "I saw the files in 71, classified Navy briefs, stuff they didn't want out," he began, his voice steady, urgent. Kennedy was murdered by a secret government faction in the CIA. The driver, William Greer, turned and shot him in the head with a special weapon. I saw it in a film they hid, clear as day. Lee Harvey Oswald was a patsy, set up to take the fall, a nobody they pinned it on. It was about control, keeping their power intact, money, influence, the whole damn system. He paused, the hum of the broadcast filling the silence, then pressed on. I read those docs, dates, codes, names blacked out but the truth screaming through. They killed him to stop him, to keep us in line. Greer's shot wasn't random. It was planned, cold, final. Oswald didn't fire a thing that mattered. He was their goat, their lie. Cooper's voice rose, a preacher's cadence. This isn't guesswork. It's what I saw, what they buried. The secret government runs it all, and Kennedy was their warning. The airwaves trembled with his conviction, a lone beacon in a sea of denial. Then a faint crackle, static swallowed his words, the signal cutting out, leaving his broadcast hanging, unresolved, a jagged truth lost to the night.